Okay, Kareem's here too. Good. So we've got a decent crowd now, haven't we? We'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes. Maya and Kareem, could you go into the chat? If you just arrived, guys, go into the chat and download the extract. We're looking at the opening of the play today until line 66, okay? Now, once you've got that, I've got a little starter activity while we wait for a couple of other people. I'm asking you, how has Shakespeare made this opening scene engaging, dramatically engaging? Could you have a look at these lines here and maybe scribble down a couple of ideas that you might have for how Shakespeare's made this a very dramatic opening? Just a couple of minutes. Okay, folks. Kareem, can you come in on the call, please? Kareem,
Yep.
How are you? You okay?
Good, sir, thanks.
So, Kareem, I'm going to ask you quickly now. Can you tell me how the opening of the play is made dramatic by Shakespeare? Give me a couple of points.
Well, it starts in media res.
It does.
So Shakespeare establishes conflict there.
What about the first word, Kareem? It's tush, which would mean shut up or quiet.
So it's clear there's like a power dynamic between Iago and Rodrigo, and there's like.
Absolutely. So it begins in anger, it begins in a dispute, it begins not with an I am. Usually Shakespeare writes an iambic pentameter. Here it begins with a dactyl, a stressed T, doesn't it? Tush, never tell me. I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, hast had my purse, as if the strings were thine. So it opens with a strong sense of anger and complaint. Sasha, come in on the call, please.
Hi, sir.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Look at Iago's reply. What do you make of that, Sasha?
I think, again, it establishes kind of that Iago is maybe of a higher level than Rodrigo, or at least socially that's the case.
Do you know what? I hate to correct you, but Rodrigo's significantly wealthier than Iago. He is a wealthy fool, or a dolt, or a gull. And we can immediately tell, Sash, with Iago's language, the blood. It's a curse. It's a swear word in Shakespeare's day. But you'll never hear me. If ever I did dream of such a matter, abhor me. So the strength of his language comes through. So we begin with anger, with aggression in the midst of a dispute. The first time we see Iago, there is dissension and anger, and we realize that he is a kind of arch manipulator. So it's a dramatic opening, and the whole of the first scene is going to be highly dramatic. It's about conflict, it's about rage, and it's about flooding the stage with people. Let me move on. So in today's session, I want to look at the significance of the play's opening. I want to consider the idea of the malcontent and the Machiavellian villain. So I'll look at a bit of context. And then I'm going to look at the theme of how Shakespeare portrays race and gender in these opening lines, okay? The PowerPoint is in the chat. The extract that you're going to need, bring that up now if you haven't done that, because you're going to be needing to look at the extract as we go along, okay? Moving on. So, as we said, the play opens with Rodrigo and Iago on a Venetian street at night. The opening, as Kareem rightly said, is in media res, and Rodrigo and Iago in the midst of an argument. So it's conflict from the beginning. Now, one of the things I'm going to be arguing in today's lesson is that Act 1 is almost a play in itself. It's a comedy. It follows the pattern of Shakespeare's comedy. It opens with conflict, etc. That conflict intensifies, and then we know that in the court scene, the conflict is resolved. So it's almost like a play within itself. It's like a comedy. Act 2 will then introduce the reversal and the problematization that will begin a different genre, the genre of tragedy, okay? So in terms of content, let's not forget that there was no stage scenery, no stage curtain. They might have had some torches here, etc., and they might have used different levels in order to show Brabantio arriving. But on the whole, the stage was empty and bare, and the audience or the groundlings were extremely close to the stage. Right, moving on. Now, a little bit more context before we start a task. The malcontent, this archetypal character, is very much common to Shakespearean and to indeed Jacobean plays in general. The malcontent is a kind of character who's discontented. Now, this is very interesting because Shakespeare is writing at a time when British society is changing, when a lot of people are upwardly mobile. Those of you who've studied the Tudors in history will know that a lot of working class people become elevated, that social hierarchies are breaking down, and that there's real fear of this kind of masterless man, the malcontent who wants to change his social position. Some examples of this are Malvolio in Twelfth Night, Edmund the bastard son in Lear, and Hamlet in Hamlet, of course. And then, of course, we have Iago. So the malcontent is someone who's often an outsider, dissatisfied. They often use soliloquies, and they often use the audience as an accomplice. Some of you with your English teacher would have studied the figure of Vice, who was another archetype of medieval mystery plays. And clearly Iago has a lot of resemblance to this figure of Vice, this character who's really angry, who's energetic, who's creative, and who conspires with the audience a great deal. Now, I spoke to my class about this today, so I'm going to go quite briefly through. It is absolutely essential that we reflect about the work of Machiavelli, who had an enormous effect on the way that English people viewed Italy. Now, he was a political philosopher, and he wrote a fabulous book called The Prince. And in it, he argued that we should not care about what is in our heart. We should think about how we portray ourselves to others. So it's all about show and not soul. Now, that might resonate with you. You may recognize Iago there. And also, the prince said that the great prince or the monarch should be excused from performing violence and deception if it was for the greater good. As I say in point 3 here, in effect, that the end justifies the means. Now, this has an enormous impact on the way English audiences view Italy. And if you look across at revenge tragedy, it tends to be set in Italy for the reason that the Machiavellian malcontent kind of hero is seen as distinctly Italian. So Shakespeare's working on a tradition there of Elizabethan Jacobean drama that uses this. Okay, I hope you're all following. Now, what's key is that in Othello, Shakespeare allows the antagonist Iago to speak first. Now, if we're thinking about linking the beginning of the play to later parts of the play, I'm going to contend that Shakespeare gives the best soliloquies to Iago. And this is interesting because if you're reflecting about the tragic form, usually the protagonist is given the greatest lines. Now, that's certainly the case in Act 5 when Iago is silenced and marginalized. But until this point, Iago has many of the best lines. We understand his motives, and we go into the interior of Iago far more than we go into the interior of Othello. Now, this is very different from many other tragedies, especially Hamlet, the Dane, the Prince of Denmark, where we go almost completely into his soliloquies, into his head. And it's very interesting that the play, as I say here, will be structured around dramatic irony. So when you're looking at the passages, guys, I strongly recommend you look for dramatic irony because it begins immediately. The audience are given a special relationship with Iago. We understand him. He speaks to us and we know what he is doing. And later on, that dramatic irony is going to be highly effective in the tragedy because we're going to see the undoing of Othello, and we, the audience, understand exactly what's going on. And we feel this pain and this tension, and we wish that he could share our knowledge, which were given by Shakespeare right from the beginning. So we see in our antagonist in this early scene the fact that our hero is facing a formidable adversary. And that's very important. because many critics will write more about Iago than they do about Othello. Many people will feel that he's a far greater character in terms of the dramatic genre. Now, this is the kind of question we always get. The significance of aspects of dramatic tragedy in the following passage and as the play as a whole. I just want to remind you guys that I would always begin each of these passage questions with a kind of overview of the scene that you're going to look at, in which you focus on why the tragedy is so significant in this scene. So that would be the way that you set up an argument. We're not given a proper question in the Shakespeare, so you have to kind of build in a response yourself and decide what it is about this particular scene that you're going to highlight. Because every piece of writing, every introduction should clearly delineate some kind of purpose for writing, okay? And we'll talk about that in a moment when we look at this. Now, the question I've said is the presentation of Iago and Rodrigo, Shakespeare's use of dialogue, the dramatic setting and action, other relevant aspects of dramatic tragedy. Now, that's a generic question. You will get some form of that in the exam, as you all know. Now, I'm going to ask you to spend about 10 minutes. Could you annotate and read the extract in front of you? I hope you've all downloaded it for now. And I'm going to leave these questions up to guide you, okay? So I'm going to put my stopwatch on now, and you now have 10 minutes to read through and to look closely at these questions, okay? Okay, everyone, I'm going to get started, okay? What I'm going to do is on the next slides, I have taken bits of the speeches that I think are absolutely vital, and I'm going to ask you for some feedback as I go through, okay? So you can follow me on the screen or you can look at the paper that's in front of you, okay? Myra, can you come in on the call, please?
Hi, sir.
Have a quick look at this particular section. I want to focus on class bitterness and the parts of the speech that I have put in bold. Can you tell me a little bit about what you make of these?
I think this section really shows sort of his professional jealousy and how he feels that he's been sort of overtaken by someone who wasn't deserving of it. And he kind of presents Othello to be quite pompous and quite hubristic in the sense that, you know, he ignores the people that were advising him to take on Iago, but takes on Cassio instead.
Absolutely. Do you think that, say, Marxist, more political critics would be very interested in these speeches?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that from a Marxist perspective, it could be argued that that's what motivates Iago, and he's kind of trying to break the ranks of this hierarchy that's being perpetuated, and so he's the malcontent.
Myra, do you think that these charges against Othello ring true? If you were to look elsewhere in the play, does he strike you as a bombastic character?
I don't think so, because he does punish Cassio later in the play for his actions at the sort of the party scene where he's drunk and he attacks Montano. So it could be argued that he is fair in his judgment.
Okay. Now, this is a guy, I'm trying to write with my keyboard, guys. I wish I was using my iPad. This would be better. Thomas Rhymer is someone who you might want to quote. You don't only have to use modern critics. Rhymer was a contemporary of Shakespeare and thought that Othello was beyond contempt. There was no way that he could be seen as a tragic hero. And one of the charges that Rhymer makes against Othello is he agrees with Iago that he's full of he's a bombastic man who's always showing off. Very interesting, because I'm going to argue against that in a moment. Now, when we actually look at this idea of to make me his lieutenant, they off-cap to him. In other words, they showed him respect, but he, loving his own pride and purposes, evades them with bombastic circumstance. Interesting that Iago chooses this form of criticism, because in the next speeches, he's going to say that self-interest is at the core of what human beings are. And that's your link to Machiavelli and what we could call a materialistic conception of human beings, that human beings are driven by appetite, that they are by nature selfish, and that they are ambitious. And so this is a complete redefinition from, say, Christian morality, which is about kind of ideas of goodness and reaching paradise, and that the sins of the flesh are wrong. So it's a very interesting speech. Now, one of the key things that many of you know is that Iago gives many different reasons for his hatred. Samuel Coleridge-Taylor calls this motiveless malignity or motive hunting. So this is one of many, and we're going to look, we'll come back to this in a moment, okay? The next speech I want to go on to is this one, The Rival, okay? And this is going to be the focus on Michael Cassio. When you do these kind of extracts, guys, there is no mark scheme that says which parts of the play you should link to. But as we go through these speeches now, you might want to think about where else you could link this particular speech to. So I'll ask you to look at this particular section of the play for about 2 minutes, and then I'm going to pick on my old particular quotations.
I would comment on its Shakespeare creates quite a semantic field of academic studies, and he has a condemnation of it. Where there's a great arithmetician, but there's also the bookish theoric further down. He also comments has prejudice to more academic places in terms of location as well, calling Cassio a Florentine. His academic sort of attack on Cassio continues into more of a feminizing of Cassio, with calling him a spinster just before bookish theoric. I think a good place I would think to link this possibly, I would try and call out Iago here, because I think he thinks of himself. He has this hubris about it, this intellectual hubris about him. And I think it's Act 2, he says, "With as little thread as this, I shall ensnare as great a fly as Cassio." I think that's obviously an intellectual trap that he's trying to put him in.
Absolutely. So he sees himself as an intellectual. He sees himself as an artist, doesn't he?
Yes, and so in that sense, it doesn't make sense. So it would conform to Coleridge's motive hunting theory.
And so this is one of the things that puzzles us about Iago, isn't it? Is that we have multiple different motives. They're often in contradiction with one another. One of the things I'd like to say to all of you now, guys, is you need to think about Iago, who is an actor on more than one stage. And that's one of the things that the Act 1 sets up. It makes us realize that there's an Iago who acts off stage, isn't there? Who shows us his private face. And here we share with Rodrigo that Iago, the Iago of bitterness and anger, etc. Sasha, can you come back in on the call?
Hi, sir.
It's very easy to forget, Sasha, that there's a different Iago, isn't there? Could you think of a time when you would want to see Iago's behavior as entirely different in the public sphere?
I can think of when Othello arrives in Cyprus, and he's surrounded by Cassio and Othello and Desdemona, and he kind of has his alter ego face on, where he is more genteel, even though it's clear that to the audience at least that it's just an act.
You know, Sasha, it's a good point. You say genteel, but he actually plays the comic fool. He tells jokes, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And the challenge for us as readers of this play, guys, and this is something that you should look for in all the passages, is don't forget that Iago is a wildly popular guy. He's honest, Iago. Will, is it 52 times?
The word honest is mentioned 52 times.
52 times, yeah.
Honest Iago is about 24 or 25 times.
But it's almost like a collocation, isn't it? It's almost like his name collocates with honesty, though, doesn't it? We also need to remember in the brilliant scene, and this is the one that I would link this scene to, in which Iago so persuasively gets Cassio to drink. Maya, could you come in on the call, please? Are you there, Maya, or have we lost you? Maya, do you recall how clever Iago is in terms of getting Cassio to drink?
Yeah, because he's drinking as well, and then he's drinking with the other soldiers, and so it just seemed like camaraderie, really.
He calls them gallants, do you remember? And
Yeah.
he puts this enormous party pressure on Cassio. So what does that tell us about Iago in the public stage then? Yeah.
He's able to pressure people into doing things that maybe they're not comfortable with because they trust him.
Absolutely. So he's a terrifying character who can wear many different masks. Can you see that, guys? There are two different metaphors you might use. You might say that he puts on different masks, or you might say that he plays different roles. Iago is somebody who understands that appearance is everything. And I was talking to my class today about meta theater and how interested Shakespeare is in meta theater and the idea that life itself is a piece of theater. And some of you may know there's a very famous speech in As You Like It, where he says, you know, there's 7 ages of man speech, where he says, we play these different roles. So Shakespeare's fascinated by Iago. It's almost like Iago displaces Othello and becomes a kind of protagonist. And we see that right from the beginning in the fact that Iago opens the play. Now I'm going to move on to the next slide, okay? Oh, there's one other thing, sorry guys, I meant to mention, and I'll be very brief. The idea of an ancient is a very interesting one. Shakespeare deliberately gave him this role because, as I explained to my class today, it's about the highest role that you could get as a non-noble. Now, if you get the chance to, please watch the National Theatre production. And I said to my class today that Iago is like totally Cockney in it and well angry with like posh people. It's a really interesting play, a version of the play that shows this kind of class dynamic, this bitterness, this sense of being passed over because you're not of the right class with the right culture, etc. It's a very brilliant rendition of that. Now, as Will rightly said, we need to think all the time of Coleridge's charge of motiveless malignity, because one of the things that we could say is that Iago at this point was all about class, but later it's going to be about things like sexuality. It's also going to be about things like jealousy as well and passion, okay? Now, as I say here, the ensign is his role was a ceremonial one. And that's the amusing thing, because Will quite rightly pointed out that he described Cassio as an arithmetician and as a Florentine, Florence being the center of the arts, the implication being there that he's a bit of a puffdo, likes arts and reads books too much, a bit like an English teacher like me. And the ensign is actually a non-combatant. That's the great irony there, okay? Now, we talked earlier, didn't we, about this idea of the malcontent and how that is an archetype of Shakespearean drama. It's very much an archetype of a revenge tragedy. You have a character whose job it is to create the problem in the tragedy, to act as the antagonist and to drive the plot forward. And that's what Iago does. Without Iago, we have a comedy, don't we? We have Desdemona and Othello getting together, falling in love, overcoming all the difficulty. We have a resolution at the end of Act 1. What we have in Cyprus is the disruption of the comedy through the figure of the malcontent, okay? Would you quickly have a look at this slide over here? Just 1 minute, and then I'm going to ask my student Sean to come in 1 minute, okay, guys? Quick little look at this section of.
So yeah, this part you can definitely see an element of class antagonism, like pretty clearly, because with the letter and affection and not by old graduation, you know, kind of saying that it's by more like who you know, who you're friends with in, you know, the noble class. And also I think the phrase curse of service is interesting because it kind of shows that, like, this has repeatedly happened, because, you know, it's like, it's not like a one time, it's like the curse for like a poorer person trying to rise their way through the ranks.
Now, the interesting thing, Sean, is that Jacobean theatre, Elizabethan theatre was incredibly socially mixed. The audience listening to these lines might feel very differently according to their class. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like the more working class people would definitely, I think, kind of like agree with Iago and even kind of support him to an extent, especially in this opening scene when you don't know he's a villain yet.
Absolutely. So there we have it, guys. I think Sean's hit the nail on the head. These lines would resonate with the people who we call the groundlings. Be careful with the word working class. It's more 19th century. Perhaps say laboring class is better, or use the term groundlings. They're the people who paid 1 penny and were on the ground, okay? However, the aristocracy would have seen this incredibly differently. As I said, the boogeyman, the bad guy of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre is somebody who they called the masterless man. That's someone who didn't recognize his place in society as being where he had to stay. And it was like a terrifying figure who threw the great chain of being into disarray. Many of you will know the great chain of being idea, the Elizabethan idea, that we all had our gradations in our places. Now, of course, Iago is somebody who rejects this, isn't he? However, as I said to my class today, Othello is also very difficult to place in terms of the chain of being, because he's an outsider who has risen up inside Venice to an astonishing degree. So his position is a really interesting, ambiguous, and hybrid one. And that really is why he is so vulnerable and what his undoing is. Now, appearance and reality, as I've said before, is possibly the most important theme in this play. And I've linked that to Machiavelli and to the idea of Iago as being a consummate actor who knows how to play different roles on different stages. Have a 1-minute look at the speech. I'm going to go quite fast now because I want to finish and do a few links. Just have a quick read of that. Okay, Jana, can you come in on the call?
Yeah, hello.
Okay, so we have Iago telling us who's his kind of model person. And how self-interest is a wonderful thing. Tell me a little bit about that.
So he looks up to people. It says here, "Wit me such honest knaves." So he's calling people who are honest and noble as stupid, basically. And instead, like similar to what Machiavelli was saying, he thinks that people who hide basically put on an outward show to get what they want. They are the ones that should be followed.
Excellent. Now, Jana, could you link to a couple of parts of the play where you think this theme of, you know, appearance and reality we could link nicely? What would you choose?
Maybe when the whole handkerchief plot, because he doesn't consider what will happen to Othello and Desdemona. He doesn't really care about that. He's motivated by his own self-interest, and then he thinks that the ends of that will justify the means, and the means would be ruining Desdemona and Othello's relationship.
And what's so interesting, Jana, is the fact that later he will contradict himself completely. With Othello, he says men should be what they should seem, doesn't he? What does he mean by that?
He's saying that men should be what they are, so they shouldn't put on a show. They should be honest, even though throughout the whole play he does the complete opposite. So that's just testament to how he manipulates what he says based on his own self-interest and what plans he has.
So because he has this brilliant conception of the power of appearance, he's able to utilize that as the kind of weapon, the tool to undo Othello, would you say?
Yeah, I think so, because he manipulates how he himself looks and also how others look. So, for example, he manipulates how Desdemona looks to Othello, and that's linking to the theme of appearance.
So I think it's a brilliant idea that you talk about the handkerchief, guys. The phrase that everyone should remember is the ocular proof. Do you remember that? Because the handkerchief is not ocular proof at all, is it? It's mere appearance. And what Iago is able to do, which completely contradicts the speech over here, is to say to Othello, what you see is basically seeing is believing. And here we see with Rodrigo, when he's speaking to us personally, he understands that life is about playing roles and manipulating appearances. So imagine the audience watching him. They've got a combination, I think, of horror and fascination, because the cleverness of his plot and ploy is something that is almost attractive. One of the key things about Iago is he speaks to us, the audience, just like the figure of vice, as though we are co-conspirators with him. Those of you who've gone to the theatre and have seen this will see that Iago turns to you all the time and says, hey, come with me. There's a kind of intimacy that we have with him, which is kind of quite terrifying. Right, moving on very quickly. And very quickly here, were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. Now, what I'm going to point out here is two paradoxes, okay, that I think are really interesting. Paradox number one, in following him, I follow but myself. Now, Iago speaks in terms of paradoxes. Now, this is very interesting for you guys studying Macbeth as well. One of the key bogeymen, again, for Jacobeans was the idea of the Catholic equivocator, the person who plays with words. And you can see the witches undo Macbeth through their equivocation. He actually calls it equivocation later. And it seems that Iago is the same. He speaks in these verbal paradoxes. How can you follow obediently but actually become your own master? Well, Iago shows us how to do that. And this ends in this horrible image that is so typical of the brutality of Iago's imagery, whether it's the zoomorphism, whether it is the description of sexuality as some filthy, disgusting, appetite-driven thing. Here he says, I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for daws to peck at. So he has an external heart, he'd like crows to eat it. And so again, this is part of this kind of very visceral, angry relationship that Iago has. And this is very interesting. I am not what I am. Does anyone recognize that this is a quote that is very similar to the Bible? Is there anyone here who knows that? Yes, who is that? Elliot, is it? Sean. Come on, Sean, Tommy.
So the quote says, I am not what I am. And the Bible basically references to I am who I am, and that's God basically speaking.
So it's like a kind of antichrist scripture, do you think, Sean?
Well, saying that it's the complete opposite of God's words would kind of give me connotations that it is antichrist or Iago sort of going against the grain.
Yes, I agree. I think that's an excellent answer. Thank you for that, Sean. Okay. And now I'm going to move on very quickly. As Sean pointed out, it's Moses. When God speaks to Moses, he says, I am what I am. In Greek, it is, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Okay. And one of the points is that I want to really emphasize at this point is we have to talk about tragedy throughout your discussion. So in terms of tragedy, one of the things that actually drives the tragedy is human beings' inability to see the truth, isn't it? And this is a very Christian theme that runs throughout the Bible. St. Paul says in Corinthians, we see but through a glass darkly, okay? Human beings can't really see the truth. And this inversion of I am what I am here shows us the kind of frailty of the mortal world. And so you could say, I think the tragedy is intensified by this kind of Christian element. So let's not forget that when you're talking about Aristotle, guys, Shakespeare breaks with Aristotle a lot of the time. Don't use that as your sole thing to talk about tragedy about, because Othello really doesn't conform to Greek tragedy or Aristotelian tragedy. You can use some of those concepts if you think they're useful, like catastrophe, catharsis, peripeteia, hamartia. You can use those, but don't feel as though Shakespeare really conformed to Aristotelian tragedy, because he didn't. He actually violates many of the unities of Aristotelian tragedy. And now, if you did my lesson today, we talked a lot about zoomorphism and we talked a lot about synecdoche. And these are elements now of the racial discourse that Shakespeare draws upon to bring out the kind of racial hatred of Othello. And Rodrigo says, what a full fortune does the thick lips owe, if he carry thus. Now, you can almost imagine a guffaw from the racist Jacobean audience, okay? Shakespeare is trading in stereotypes here. But the key thing to remember, folks, is he is putting these words into the mouth of a villain and the mouth of a gull, a fool, an idiot. And so it's kind of quite interesting because it's tempting sometimes to see Shakespeare as maybe sharing these values, particularly as Queen Elizabeth asked for all blackamoors to be removed from London. So we know that there was a lot of racist discourse at the time. But it's very interesting, I think, that these racist words are put in the mouths of the fool and the villain. Okay, now linking to the rest of the play, these are some of the ideas I had. Remember what I said, there's no formula, and you should not wait till the end of your extract to start linking. As you read the passage, you need to think to yourself 3 or 4 or possibly even 5 links. Now, 1 or 2 of those links might be quite small. Another one might be where you want to show development or action, okay? So I said to you, I think it's interesting that we could look at the motive hunting of Iago. We could look at the honest Iago idea that we discussed before, and we could look at maybe how that contrasts with the delusions of Othello. Iago calls Othello an ass, and he says, I will lead him by the nose. So he understands that Othello is someone who believes in honesty and appearances, and in Othello's world, that's weakness and foolishness. We can already see this idea of Othello as the cultural other. And one of the things that we might want to look at is how he begins to internalize those racist descriptions and conceptions of himself. We could talk about the energy of Iago, the vice archetype. Will came out with an excellent quote earlier. And there's so many images where we see, he talks about it as his poison, his medicine, his net, his bird lime. We have these extraordinary image clusters where he describes his plot like some kind of artistic creation. So we could link with that. We could talk about the theatricality of Iago, because as I said, I think it's very interesting that we see this Iago first. But let's not forget, in the next scene, we're going to see Iago speaking to Othello, and if anything, he's subservient to Othello. So we see this extraordinary contrast in his characterization, and we begin to understand that he is a very slippery fellow. We see in this scene the pattern of dramatic irony, and we, the audience, are going to feel pain. So we could talk later about something like the handkerchief, where that dramatic irony is deeply painful for us. And if you like, you could also link to this idea of Rodrigo's role as the dolt or the gull, which was a standard figure in Shakespeare's day. If any of you like British comedy, you might know the stupid kind of posh boy, hampers and kind of, you know, public school fool kind of boy. And this is what Rodrigo resembles, okay? Now, I haven't left myself an enormous amount of time, but I thought that this is a very interesting idea. There's a kind of colonization that's going to go on in the play. And I'm going to suggest to you that an interesting reading is to see Iago as a psychological colonizer, as someone who colonizes Othello's mind, and who is able to write a new script of other people. I spoke to my class before. There's a brilliant essay, which I'll make available to anyone who wants it, about Iago infecting people. And he infects people with his language and his conception of the world, which is this kind of materialistic, cynical, selfish conception of the world. But notice in the speech how brilliant Iago is. Good name in man and woman, my dear Lord, is the immediate jewel of their souls. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you here is Iago understands Othello's code of honor and his morals. This is how Othello sees the world. Honor. He's a man of great military honor and reputation. So he mimics him. And in so doing, he is now going to infect him with his own view of the world, so that Othello will lose his whole confidence in perception. He will lose confidence in the way that he conceived of the world prior to this. He says here, "'Twas mine, 'tis his, and has been a slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name." And yet we know, don't we? And here's where you would want to link to virtue, 'tis a fig, reputation, idly got. He is able to move from position to position, and he becomes a kind of ventriloquist for other people's belief systems. He infects them, and he changes those belief systems, okay? Now we are in a really interesting link that I would like to maybe use as the end, as the kind of plenary to this particular lesson, is the idea that Othello is by contrast an idealist. And that's something that Iago understood. And that is why he is going to put himself up as an executioner. Now, these days in the 21st century, in the time of Me Too and the time in which domestic violence, etc., is seen as obscene and something that we're very worried about, it's very difficult in some respects to watch Othello today and to see him murder his wife as she begs, and to really kind of redeem him as a tragic hero, okay? One of the things that we might be able to do to help redeem him, and I'm not justifying, like killing your wife or domestic violence, is the fact that Othello sees himself as an idealist, as a man who was completely committed to an idea of moral justice. And here in the speech, many of you remember, it is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chase stars. He can't even bear to mention what this particular crime is. And so the way that Iago frames the catastrophe, because this is the catastrophe of the play, the way in which he justifies it is to see himself as a kind of noble executioner. And he says here, "Yet she must die, else she betray more men." And it's a brilliant scene in which he is clearly going through an absolute sense of agony. "O balmy breath," he says, "that does almost persuade justice to break her sword." So it's not a role that he finds easy. And it's because he has such a different worldview from Iago. As I say, a world of honor codes, a world of moral absolutes, a world of religion, a world of kind of justice, of cosmic justice. So one of the things that you can see from the early scene is that this tragedy is about the collision of two worlds. And another interesting theorist on tragedy is a guy called Hegel. And Hegel points out that tragedy is really enhanced by the fact when you have a clash of two different worldviews. And I think that that's what you get in Othello. You get a playing out between a materialistic, selfish, ego-driven, physical conception of what it is to be human, and one that is much more religious, much more about honor, much more about justice and absolute morality. Now, I had intended, guys, to go through the linking, but my recording's about to end. So if you look at the extracts, a very interesting thing for you to do there would be to annotate those and to make sure that as you go through the scene, you have 4 or 5 moments in the play that you could refer to in more detail. Now I'm going to stop there. I hope that that was very useful, and we will be doing more of these. Thanks so much for coming. I do appreciate it. Goodbye.